In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can do some rendering inside of ZBrush. So this video is not going to go super in-depth about how you set up lighting and things like that. I'm mainly going to talk to you about how you can set up your document to render in different aspect ratios, different resolutions, and then we'll talk a little bit about setting up some of the best possible render settings for shadows and ambient occlusion. Alright, the first thing that we're going to be taking a look at is controlling our document size. So we're going to go under Document, and you can see that we've got some settings here. My document is actually set up to be 1920 by 1200, and I could change that. We've got a proportional button on here, so whatever's set with these numbers, it'll keep those proportions if we change it to something like 2000 pixels wide and hit Tab. You can see how it changes that, but if I want to do something very specific, like say 600 pixels by 800 pixels, and I hit resize, I'll ask if I want to resize my document. I'll go ahead and say yes for this. I'll clear my canvas because ZBrush has some 2.5D capabilities, and when we change our canvas size, it basically takes whatever we have and maybe drops it down to the canvas. So we'll hit Control N to clear the canvas, and you see our cursor is white. We should still be on the same subtool that we were working with. Just go ahead and take the canvas, click and drag down like this so it draws it onto the screen, and then we hit T to go into edit mode here, and then our cursor should change to a red kind of color now at that point. So I'm just going to zoom in and out just a little bit to get this thing set up kind of the way that I want to render. Okay, so I already have the best possible render settings set up. I'm going to be covering that a little bit later on exactly how to get that set up, but for right now I can hit this button here, or you can see the hotkey for it if we hover over it is Shift R. So I'm going to hit Shift R and let it render. So here's the image after it's been rendered out, and you can see this is the aspect ratio that I want to keep in this kind of setting if I want to render a bit higher. So I'm going to steal some functionality that we have with a tool called ZapLink, which we looked at earlier videos on how we can do some texturing, things like that. So ZapLink actually sits under this document area, and at the very bottom there's this ZapLink properties that we can open up. And we can actually store camera views to this. I do know from experience that if I made this more of a straight on view for front, if I clicked front, it's going to give me the back view at the same time. I'm going to use these custom 1 and 2 buttons. I'm actually just going to use this one here. So I like this view that we've got here for the front, so I'll just click custom 1 for that, and it'll actually store this view. I'm going to use this functionality because we're going to be increasing the size of our render area. So I'm going to go to Document. I'm going to turn on this proportion button because now I'm going to put this up to, let's say we go up to like I don't know, 2000 in the width, and hit Tab, and you can see it auto fills in this height for us. So I'm going to go ahead and say resize. It's going to go ahead and resize it for us. Remember, we want to clear our canvas out, so let's hit Control N. And then now I'm going to put this on AA half. And what that's actually doing, it's kind of the same thing inside of Photoshop if we zoomed out to look at our document at 50%. You can see this document size is still too big to actually see the entire document, so we can actually use the zoom and just scroll out a little bit to make sure it all fits within this area so we can see it. And again, this isn't actually doing anything other than maybe zooming in and out on the document. As far as like in Photoshop, you know, if you zoom in really close, you could actually see the actual pixels that were being drawn with. It's the same thing within here in ZBrush. So don't get that confused with actually zooming or scaling your model to actually be sculpting on. This is just a visual thing to see the canvas here. So again, my cursor is white. I need to redraw this character on the screen. So I'm just going to click and drag down like that. And remember, we're going to go into edit mode, so you can hit this or tap T. And I can roughly get it in the right position, but what I really want to do is use that camera that I stored down here. So I'm just going to hit custom 1, and then our camera is all set up again. And now when we render, we're going to be rendering at this higher resolution. So I'm going to hit Shift R again to do this best possible render, and we'll see the results when this is done. Okay, our render is done, and here's what it looks like. Let's go ahead and look at it at the actual size, so that's 1:1. And you can see it's got a really nice quality look to it. It's just whenever we look at it and it's kind of the document is actually zoomed out, it kind of tears the edges a little bit. So we can just look at that at actual, and you could even zoom in, just like I was saying, like inside of Photoshop, you can actually see these individual pixels at that point. But you definitely probably want to take a look at this actual, and then you can use this scroll to kind of look around the document. So there's some different ways that we can get this image outside of ZBrush. So we could go to Document, and we can say Export, and then I'm just going to throw this on the desktop real quick and just give this a 1 at the end of it. Save that, and then hop on over to Photoshop, and let's take a look at that. So I'll go ahead and open that from the desktop and find this new image that I saved out, and we can check the image quality inside of Photoshop at that point. So I'll tap F, and tap F again, and I'm going to hit Control Alt and 0 to give me one-to-one representation. So obviously this looks pretty nice. Again, in BPR, I'm going to have some settings on here that kind of sharpens up the image, kind of like doing a filter sharpen inside of Photoshop. And then we've got the shadows turned on with a little bit of ambient occlusion. And you can see this resolution of the shadows probably is not the best for this render size that I was doing. The size that I was doing before was 1920 by 1080, and the shadows held up pretty nicely, but you can kind of see this stuff is not holding up so great at the higher resolution. So if you want to be really picky about that, you could change some of the shadow resolutions, and we're going to look at that. So let's hit Tab for this. I'll hit F again to get out of this mode, and then we'll hop back on over to ZBrush. So that's one way of getting the entire image out. The other cool thing about doing best possible renders is I'm going to just put my render palette, and I'm going to click it and drag it over here to dock it in this area. And we're going to do BPR render passes. So you can go ahead and click out, this is the beauty pass. You can kick out this depth. This is the shadows that we have going on, the ambient occlusion, and then the mask. So if I click on this for each one of these individual pieces, you can see on the desktop I can just click this and hit save. And it's got the word depth on there for this one. I'll hit save. Click on here and hit shadow. I'll save that out. The AO, and then the mask, like that. Let's hop back over to Photoshop, and let's open up these different maps. So I'm going to hit File, Open, go to the desktop, and we'll find these new images. I'll do this real quick. We're going to go by Details and then Date Modified, so I can grab all the latest stuff that was done. Let it open for that. And you can see here's our beauty pass. It doesn't have the background information with it, but if I double click on this, and you can see that I've got my background layer, I can release that and make it just a normal layer. Let's take a look. We remember we kicked out one of those masks, so I can hit Control A, which selects everything, Control C, which is going to copy, and then now I can do a layer mask on here. So I'm going to put this little mask button here, and then I'm going to hold down Alt and then click on this image so I can see my mask that I'm using, and I'm going to hit Control V to paste this mask into here, like that. So now you can see this actual mask. I'm going to hold down Alt, click on that image again. It's going to take me back to my normal mode, and you can see how that mask is now knocking out that background. If I hold down Shift, I can turn on and off that effect of that. So we've got that going on. I like to use solid color layer, so I can just click down here and hit solid color layer and give this a color, and we'll just do this kind of bluish kind of color like that. And I'll put this down below. So I'll click and drag it down below this right here like that. So we've got one solid color, and I can make another one. I'll just hit solid color, and I'll give this a color of black like this. And it automatically puts this mask on here, which is pretty cool because now I can use my gradient tool. So you tap G, or I can click in here and make sure you're on gradient tool. And I'm going to use this version of the gradient, which is the foreground color to transparent, and it's on a linear gradient. and my opacity is set to 33%, so I can just click and drag a line down holding shift, and it constrains that line. And actually I need to be using black as my color, so I'll tap X to swap these two colors here. So I'll drag this out, and you can see now I can build a gradient. The cool thing about these solid colors is if I want to change the color at any point, if I want to change it to a more of a reddish color or whatever, it's going to be really easy for me to go through and do that. So I'll just go ahead and pick a darker color, kind of like that. The other thing we could do is once we have that mask turned on here, we could right click and say blending options and maybe turn on stroke. We could try that, and we could make it right now the stroke is black. We could change the color of that to white. You can change the opacity of that stroke. So there's a lot of different options that you could play around with after you've got some of these pieces rendered out. So again, we've got a mask. You see how that works. If we wanted to look at just the ambient occlusion that's being generated, you can take a look at that, and that could be used as maybe a multiply. This is the beauty path, so I probably wouldn't want to do this, but you can just see if you wanted to increase the effect of this, you could tap V to put it on your move tool, click and drag it over and hold down shift, and it should constrain the adding this thing. Let me make a new layer real quick. It was copying over incorrectly. Hold down V, drag it over, and then add shift like this. So I think what's going on here, it doesn't really like that because it's kicking this thing out as multi-channel. So I need to change this to grayscale because this thing is set to a mode of RGB color. So I need to get this thing in the same color space. So once I put on off the multi-channel to grayscale, I can now change it from grayscale to RGB color, and now I can drag this thing over on top of that, and you can see everything is going to come over okay. And then I can set this to multiply if I want. And if it's set to multiply, so it's going to take the black dark pixels, sorry, and it's going to multiply that over the top of whatever the image is below. So you can see we can turn that effect on and off like that. So that's how you can do something with the AO pass. And I'll go ahead and save the changes to that. I'm gonna have to do the same thing with the shadow. So I'm gonna go to mode, put it on grayscale, mode, RGB color, and then now I can hold that and take that over with shift, and then I can put that on multiply, and you can see the effects that that's having. So this would be if you want to, you know, really kind of crank up your shadows a little bit more, you could multiply that over the top. And I'll save the changes for that. I'll do the same thing for this depth. So let's go change the mode to, it's already grayscale, but it is 16 bits. I could change that to 8-bit and then go to RGB color, and I'll copy this whole thing. Before I do that, let me show you what I'm going to do here. I'm going to copy everything in this document. Hit Control A to select all. Do Control Shift C to do a copy merge, so it's copying like everything as we see it, and hit Control V to paste that. And then now I'm going to do this. I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, and do a Gaussian blur. And you can see it's pretty blurry like this, right? And okay. And then now I'm going to put a mask on this, which there's no change, just adding the mask. And I'm going to copy this information into the mask for this. So I'm going to hit Control A to select all, Control C to copy, go over here to this mask. We're going to hold down Alt, click on it, hit Control V to paste it in there, and I'm going to hold down Alt and click on this again to see the effects. So now you can kind of see what's going on. Wherever it was really white, it's going to let that blurriness come in, and then wherever it's dark, it's not going to be so blurry. So that's the opposite of what I need. So I can just make sure this little mask, you can see if we click here, this is the image. If we click here, it's the mask. I can just hit Control I to inverse that. And so you can see now it's blurring out everything that's further away from the camera, and everything that's closer to the camera is going to be in focus at that point. And you do have the ability to hit Control L, which gives you the ability to mess around with your levels, and you could change some of this stuff with these sliders to kind of play around with which part is really blurry and which part is not. So you can tweak that just a little bit. So that's some different options for you for kicking out these best possible renders. Okay, so let's also go to ZBrush and let's look at how we can set up the actual best possible render settings to get a nice kind of look. So I'm going to go to this render properties here, and you can see I've got shadows turned on, I have ambient occlusion turned on, and I do have transparent turned on as well. To get this to render with transparency, let's talk about this real quick because I don't have this helmet to where it's transparent. You can hold down Alt and click on an object and it'll actually select it. Let's go to solo. So we got it on the glass here. What I need to actually do is go to the tools area for this, and then we're going to go to display properties, and you can see under BPR settings that we can actually turn on BPR transparent shading, and that's going to actually take the object and tell it to be transparent. Now I think when you first turn that on, it's going to tell you need to enable this in the render properties, which you can see mine is turned on. And then now at this time, whenever we render, I'm going to hit Shift R and let it render best possible render again. I'll pause the video so you don't have to sit here and watch this bar build up at the top. Okay, and here's the look we're getting with actually doing the BPR render after we set it up to be transparent. Now there are some settings within here where you can kind of change the BPR visibility and things like that, so you could play around with that a little bit. There's also under BPR transparency, you can actually affect the transparency through here with some of the different numbers, and you have to kind of do some of your own tests to kind of figure out exactly, you know, how to build that transparency up and maybe a specific look that you're going for. But for my rendering purposes, I thought this was a pretty cool look, so I wasn't too concerned about that. So that's how you at least get that stuff enabled, by turning that on. So the other thing to talk about is shadows and ambient occlusion. So let's go to BPR shadows, and you can see here's some of the different settings that I've used for the way that I'm rendering. So I'm going to scroll this up a bit so we can kind of see some of the shadow settings for the floor and things like that. There's this global strength, which you can see I'm at a little bit higher than 0.5, and then the floor strength is 0.7. So this shadow that you see on the floor, if you have your floor enabled, you're going to get a shadow on the floor whenever you render, and this controls how opaque that shadow is here with the shadow strength. So I found for myself I like this value of 0.7 against this global strength of a little bit higher than 0.5. Then we've got our arrays for how many arrays are actually being generated for making the shadow itself. And then we've got a resolution. I can't remember this raise if that was a little bit higher, but I did notice if I put this down to 1, I was getting more of a shadow than I expected, which was just, it felt like it was from one light source. If this raise was up higher, it seemed like I had multiple lights that were making up the shadow. I personally didn't like the look of that all that much. I have the angle set really low as well. This is like 1.8, whatever. The number doesn't really matter. You could put that on 2 or something like that. This resolution, you could think of this as a resolution of 2048 by 2048. I think it's going to be like a square resolution. So if we do a half and I zoom out just a little bit, you got to think about, I think this shadow, if it was a square resolution, maybe that's why it's getting stretched along the whole entire image, and then the quality isn't holding up quite as well, so maybe for my renders at this size I might need to go up to 4096 like that, and maybe that will give me better results. This blur is how blurry this edge for the shadow is that you see here, so I've got mine set up pretty high. And this V depth, I think I've set this to -4. That actually is like the contrast on the shadow. I noticed if this was set to 0, it kind of produces this almost dirty kind of look across your entire model. So if I give a negative number on this, -4, it kind of really helps the look of things a bit more. And let's hop down to AO. So we've got rays on this, I do think matter for this. So I have it set to 16, an angle of 360. I turn the blur down pretty low to 1. The resolution on this, I don't think it needs to be quite as high as the shadow, but you can see I probably should bump that up to 2048 because I'm doing these higher renders. And I'm leaving this V depth alone. You could try to push that to a little bit of a negative number, but I seem to be getting pretty decent results with what we have. So I'm going to hit Shift R again one more time just to check these setting changes that I made as far as the map size and see what those produce. Okay, it looks like the render's done, so let's go ahead and click on actual so we can see the resolution of this. And I'm going to click and slide this down. So you can see, yeah, we've upped the numbers for this stuff, and definitely the shadow resolution has been increased. Still see a little bit of faceting here and there, but I think it should be pretty good for what we're doing. So again, after you get done with these, it's just a matter of going through and going to the render passes and then re-kicking out those images that we had.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the background colors that we see here. So I'm going to put this and zoom this out so we can see the entire document, and just scroll this up a little bit so we can see this. And we're going to talk about how we can change our background color on here. So if we go to document, we can actually dock this, grab this and dock it over here into this slot, or we could throw it over in here and have this open over here. Either one will be fine. So you see that we've got this background color that's actually giving us our overall color that we have, and we have a rate and a range and a center. So this range gives us this spectrum of kind of maybe the contrast between the gradient for the top and the bottom and this middle part that you see here. So I don't want a crazy amount of gradation going on, so I might have to put that at a pretty low number. I've got it like 0.1 or 0.2, right around there, and that gives a nice gradient for that. I think if you saw earlier in the video, when we changed the aspect ratio from 1920 to this like 800 or 600 by 800 aspect ratio, it did change this gradation that we had back here. So you do have to set this whenever you're changing your document size. The other thing is we've got this center value here that if we change that, you can see it actually changes where's the center of that gradient going to fall. And I usually just leave that at about 0.5. And then we also have what we looked at for this rate that you see here, which is going to make it a higher contrast between the white and the dark here. Now it is possible to play with you know, all these different values and kind of build up something that you might be looking for, but I found for me, I think some numbers that work pretty good. Like I said, I've got 0.2 on this, 0.5 for the center, and then this rate was set pretty low. I think this was about 0.2 as well. So this is how you can set up a nice gradient for yourself on this thing. You can change the background color. You can click on this and then drag out anywhere on the document or the color picker. So I could pick a dark color here. If I push that to black, I can go ahead and pick and then drag this over here for this thing. Now I did affect some of the colors that are going on my model, so I can go ahead and drag that back to white after I've got that set. We'll go ahead and turn the floor off just so I don't see the grid. And if I want this to be just pure black, I can take this rate all the way down to 0, and I'm going to get a solid color at that point for my background.
So that's how we can do some rendering for some still images. If I want to do something like a turntable or something like that, I'm going to show you how to set that up as well. So I'm going to go back to document. We're going to go make this, turn this proportion button off. I'm going to do 1920 by 1080, and I'm going to hit resize, and we'll go ahead and say yes for this. Clear our canvas. Remember that hotkey is Control N, and then we're going to go ahead and draw our guy on the screen here. Hit T to go into edit mode. Now it's going to tap F. F will do the framing of this. So I'm going to do AA half for this so we can check out the entire document size. And so I just want to make sure everything fits within there. Okay, I can close that up here for this part, and then I'll close up the render. And then now I'm going to go, there's a movie tab, so I can click and drag that over and dock this. So what we're going to be using is this turntable, but there are some things that we want to set first. We want to render from our document, recording only. If we do that, it's just going to render this area. If we do window, it's going to render full window recording, which is like everything, the interface and everything. I want my size to be large because I want it to be the exact size that I set over here in my document area. Let's turn that proportion on. That doesn't really matter, but let's go to modifiers and we'll take a look here. So recording, frames per second. I can't remember if that only goes to 24 for recording and playback. Yeah, we can set that. So I'm going to do recording 30 frames per second and do 30 frames playback per second. I don't actually think that matters for the turntable, but I just want to make sure everything is kind of set up the way that I like. So I'm going to do 360 for the spin frames, and I'm going to tell it to spin cycle 1. So it's going to just do 1 rotation, and it's going to kick out 360 frames for that spin. So if you wanted a really nice and slow spin for your model, you would maybe want to set this to 720, but 630 should be enough for things. Okay, and we're telling it to spin on the y-axis only, so it should go around like this. And the other thing is we've got these overlay image, which is the ZBrush logo. I don't want that to show up at all, so I'm going to close that. And then we've got title image, fade in time 2 seconds, fade out 2. Don't want any fading of any ZBrush logos or anything else like that. Let's go back to the modifier. I just want to check and make sure everything's okay. So I believe we're good here. So we're going to go ahead and click turntable, and it should start to go through and build our turntable for us. So you can see with this method, I'm getting the grid and my cursor and everything else like that. So you may possibly want that, but if you don't want those things, you can obviously turn off the floor. That'll turn off the grid, and we can actually control our cursor size later through some of the modifiers over here. That's something I didn't touch on with that. So I'm going to let it keep spinning around, and we'll come back when it's done. Okay, the movie's been rendered out, and after that's done, we can say play movie, and you can see here's what we've got here. So I did think it was capturing the grid, but apparently not, so not a big deal for that. But we're not rendering in best possible render. So you see we didn't get any transparency or anything else like that, but I would like to just do a check before I do a best possible render, because that's going to take a long time to do that. So I would advise that you don't do a best possible render before you do any of this turntable stuff that we just did. You check it out first, and then if everything's working okay, then you'll do a best possible render. So looks like everything's okay. Let's go to modifiers. I did want to see this cursor size. I could take that down to 0. That way through this turntable stuff you don't see any kind of cursor, and that won't be an issue. After the movie is created, we could say save as, and this is going to save in a ZBrush format. Like if you wanted to pull this back up in the program a little bit later and export it, you could save it as its own ZBrush file. But really what I'm interested in is doing an export and exporting this thing out. I'll just throw it on the desktop. And we're going to get these options for the compression type. I did notice H.264 does a nice job compressing, but I've had it to where it actually affects colors and levels and things like that. So I wasn't too happy with that. I could leave it at the motion 24 frames a second, or you can pump it up to 30. And I would definitely kick this out at the best quality. I did notice that we can also use MPEG-4 as a video type, and that does a little bit better job. But if I'm going to use this for my portfolio and I want the best possible quality, I would go ahead and kick this out as maybe animation, or there is a setting of none, which definitely for the none, you're going to get no compression whatsoever, and that's going to just be basically like what you see for this raw file here. So I did notice that when it kicks it out, it's going to make a very large file for you, which you might have trouble playing back in like your QuickTime player or Windows Media Player. But really what I'm doing, I'm taking the files and I'm going to Adobe After Effects. And so the playback works okay inside of there as far as you authoring the files. And then at that point with After Effects, I'm using their compression and everything to make the final video and get it down to the settings that I need. So at least from kicking out from ZBrush, I definitely want that highest quality level possible. So that's why I'm just choosing that none setting. But if you want to just kick out a video and have it made and you're not going to use After Effects, you're going to try some of those different compression settings that we saw. So let's go ahead and take a look at this video file size. I'm going to go to properties. I got this off on another window over here, and you can see what I kicked out. That thing is 2.3 gigabytes for the size, so it's going to be pretty large. So just keep that in mind. With those different compression settings, you're going to be able to get a much better look out of it. Not a better look, but a better compression with the look that you're kind of going for.
The last thing I'd like to talk to you about is how we could actually create a wireframe render inside of ZBrush. So we've already looked at if we do a best possible render, how that's going to render out that way, and we've also looked at this document area and how we can change our background color. Basically I want to get a render that has got a pure white background. My character is pure white, and then the lines for the wireframe are just pure black. So going through what we did before, we can just go to the background and just go ahead and click on that and drag out to a white color, and I definitely want to make sure that that's pure white. And also we looked at this range, the center, and then this rate, and I have that rate turned down to 0, and that's going to make sure and ensure that my background color is that pure color. So I've got that set to white for that. The other thing I'm going to do is put my material onto this flat color like you see here, and it's going to turn everything white that's doesn't have any polypaint information. I did fill some of these pieces on the model with some color, so that's pretty easy to fix. We can go to the tool settings that you see here, the tool palette, and we're going to go to subtool, and we can just hold down shift and click on any one of these brush icons here and click it again, and it should, while you're holding shift, click it again, and it should turn off all the color information for that object. So I'm also going to turn on polyframe, and it's going to show us the polyframe for this object that we have selected, which is the base here. So we've got some issues going on. We have a lot of lines going on the model because we're at a pretty high subdivision level. Now if I drop this down in the subdivision level, so if I hit Shift D and drop it down to get it to the lowest subdivision level, and then turn off polyframes and then turn that on, and then now step up in my subdivision levels, it gives me the higher resolution geometry, but it gives me the preview of the lower resolution, the base cage wires, which is going to produce a much better look whenever we actually render this thing out. So I'm just going to let the program go ahead and catch up for the memory for this. Let's take a look at how we can make sure we take off this color for the polyframe. So we're actually going to go to the preferences, and I'm going to dock this off to the right like this. And then I'm going to go to draw, and then we've got a polyframe color, which is set to black. That's what I want for my lines. That's actually controlling the color of the lines for the frame. And then we got a polyframe opacity, so we could drag that up to 100% if we want, like that. And it's going to make the lines draw 100% opaque black. And then this P-fill color, we can go ahead and click and drag that down and put that all the way to 0, and it's not going to fill our polyframe with colors anymore. So this is just one object, but if we do a best possible render, it's going to render the entire scene with these settings that we set. But before I do that, I do want to go and make sure I have my shadows turned off and ambient occlusion and everything else like that. So I'm going to go to the render palette. Let's go ahead and find that right here. I'm going to dock this one over. And then we're going to go to the render properties. I'm going to turn off shadows, ambient occlusion, and my transparency. And then now I'm going to hit the best possible render. And I'm going to let it render for a little bit. And then when this is done, we'll go ahead and check out the results. So here the render is done, and I'm going to go ahead and click on actual so we can see the quality that's been kicked out from this. And I'm just going to scroll down here. You can obviously see if surfaces have been rebuilt and resurfaced. They have a much cleaner look as far as showing a wireframe render. So a lot of these surfaces here that you see were actually just done inside of ZBrush. You saw that series of creating the geometry. So the geometry is not all that pretty, at least as far as good topology, unless you're going to rebuild that. So your wireframes are going to be pretty dense for that stuff. The other thing that I have is I took this body and did a poly reduction on it using Decimation Master, and so that produces this kind of look. So if you want really clean wireframes and you're really trying to show off your modeling abilities, this is probably not the best way to present your work. You're going to want to have all your surfaces redone in this kind of quality level. But this is how we can use ZBrush to render these wireframe paths. So I just did it for a still image, but we've already looked at how we can make a movie. So it's basically, you would want to set up the same exact cameras that you had for your turntable, and you would go ahead and render it in this mode as well, and then you could comp those together using another program like Adobe After Effects or something like that. If you're doing the still images, you could just kick this out as an image, and then you could use this as a mask, and you could actually go through and color each one of these wires different colors if you wanted to. So it's really up to you at that point, but I think I've given you a pretty good introduction into doing some different types of rendering inside of ZBrush. You could definitely build out some nice still frames and build out a nice turntable that you could put and use for your portfolio.